Welcome to the lecture on realism in game writing. And we're going to talk a lot about what that even means in a second, but I appreciate you all joining here. There are, as I've mentioned, previous lectures, both by me and other writing teachers, on things like characterization, dialogue, things like that that can help you out with more specifics. If you see something during this lecture and you're like, I don't know quite how to do that, look at previous AToMM lectures and look at the welcome document, and it will be even more specific. We're going to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time here. So here's what we're actually going to do. What is realism in writing? How does that even get defined is our first order of business. For the types of realism, there are really three that we're going to be tackling. Microrealism is at the individual level, interactions between the player and NPCs. Mesorealism is the community level, the interaction between the player and groups of NPCs or communities in general, factions maybe. And then macrorealism is the entire world space. There are also points where realism is not an option for you as a writer if you want the game to progress. We will look at those. There are not that many of them, but they're very important. So that'll be at the end, and then a brief recap and a Q&A. So let's get started. Can everyone make sure that their microphones are muted? Thank you. Let's look at what realism is. There are three basic elements of realism that you should keep in mind throughout this entire lecture. Sometimes I'm not going to reference them specifically, but these are the core of what realism is in a game. One is connection. Connection is the player's connection to an NPC, so why would they want to help the NPC or help this faction? What draws the player to this cause or this person? But it's also in the other direction, and that's the direction that is frequently forgotten. Why does the NPC or the faction trust the player to do something? Why do they rely upon your character to get things done? So that connection between people and between groups of people and the player, very, very important to realism. Otherwise, you're just running around an empty world killing things. And while we all love that at times, that's not what we're going for. Consistency is your next big element of realism. Consistency is making sure that whatever you've set up as your rules to the world stays that way. So if you've set up that, say, a Khajiit caravan travels between 3 cities, they can't show up at a 4th city for no reason. If they showed up at a 4th city, you would have to have people saying, oh yeah, we were going through the desert and we went off course and we needed more supplies. That's why we're here right now. If you just suddenly have people appearing in places they're not supposed to be, if you have set up one race as being treated badly by another race and suddenly they're not in a certain situation, you have to explain any differences to the world that you have set up. Luckily, the Elder Scrolls has tons of lore that will let you know what these rules should be for your world, but if you are building your own mod, or if you are unclear on that, make sure you do your research for consistency. And then the last one is consequences. Every action that you have in the world has consequences. I had cereal for breakfast this morning. That means I have less milk. That means that I will have to buy milk sooner. That is a consequence. It's a completely, nonsensical and silly consequence, but it's still a consequence of my actions. So everything the player does and everything that other NPCs do as a result of the player action, those count as consequences, and they stay. You can't have consequences that disappear. Say you betrayed a whole group of people. You can't then have them respawn and not remember that happened. Consequences are what make the world less of a merry-go-round of NPCs and towns and more of a realistic spot that you are placing yourself in. So that's what realism is. This is what realism is not. This might be what realism is in 3D or level design or anything to do with graphics, but as we all know from playing bad games, it does not matter how nice the graphics are if the story does not engage you and draw you in due to its realistic components. You can have the best graphics in the world and you will not make me care unless the writing is up to snuff. You can also have terrible graphics, as we all know from playing games from like the early 2000s, not fantastic. But if the story is well crafted and the realism is taken seriously and really invested in by the writers, it doesn't matter that everyone is moving like stick figures and nobody has facial expressions if you can really achieve that in writing. So if you're looking for this type of realism, the amazing trees and nice skylines type, that'll be a different lecture by someone else. So let's look at microrealism first. This is the NPC level of things. This is one-on-one interactions for the most part between NPCs and the player. And we're going to look at some quick ways to make that better. Starting with word choices. This is something I see a lot with student writing, but also sometimes with writing from my writers on projects as well. And there are 4 big categories that people tend to make mistakes on. So let's look at the top one, which is slang and informal language. Player asks, "What do you think of Wayrest?" And the NPC answers, "It's awesome. Check out the alchemy shop while you're here. You can score a lot of cool stuff." Suddenly, you are in the 21st century. You can't be in Skyrim anymore. Nobody would say that. But this sentiment isn't the problem. This person is saying the alchemy shop is really good. There's a lot of interesting things you can find there. So you can just rephrase this. You don't have to change the meaning of it. You just need to change your wording. So if you said, "What do you think of Wayrest? It's amazing. Stop by the alchemy shop while you're here. You can find a number of interesting potions you couldn't find elsewhere." Done. Fine. Nothing in there says this is modern. Nothing in there says that you're suddenly speaking in modern slang. So you can just continue with what you were doing and your immersion is not broken. Your realism is not affected. Which leads to the second one, modernisms. Player says, "Who was I supposed to meet at the mansion?" NPC responds, "Jason was meant to be there, but I think we got our wires crossed. We should all be on the same wavelength now, though." Wires crossed and wavelength are modern terms. Wires crossed is an electricity term. Not a lot of electricity in Skyrim. And then wavelength could refer to sound or could refer to light, but neither of them were really understood in the Skyrim universe. So looking at modern idioms, especially in English, this is actually one of those weird spots where people who don't speak English as a first language actually have an advantage over people who do, because people who speak English as a first language speak fluent idiom. We're really good at this sort of thing, and it's not helpful because it immediately brings you into the modern world. There's also a category which I only discovered recently called false modernisms, which is where we think something's modern and it's not. So player asks, "Do you have family in Johanna?" And the answer is, "Yes, I live with my husband Arnaud and our twin daughters Agatha and Tiffany." Tiffany, we think of as a name that is 20th century. For the most part, people encountered the name Tiffany with the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's. It became very popular in the late 20th century. You probably have met someone or know someone famous named that, and it feels super now. It's a now name. It's not an ancient name the way that Agatha might be. But that's actually not true. Tiffany goes back almost 1,000 years. It's a perfectly legitimate name for anything set in a medieval realm. And yet, it still breaks immersion because we think of it as a modernism. That's actually known as the Tiffany problem. There's an actual term for it. But for us as game writers, it's more important what people think than what's true when it comes to modernisms. If people think that that's something that was invented or a name that was used only in the modern times, it doesn't matter the truth, really. It will still break their immersion because they don't know that it was actually an older name or an older invention. So you have to go with what the player knows, not necessarily with what is right when it comes to false modernisms. If you are ever in doubt about whether something is a modernism, have a friend read your work. It's especially nice if you have a friend read your work who is from a different country or spoke a different first language, or is from a different part of the US. If you are from the West, have someone from the East read it, something like that, because in different locations, different things are considered modern. So it's an easy way to tell, just get a friend. And your last one is race-based errors. So if the player asks, how long have you been the leader of this Khajiit caravan? And the response from the Khajiit is, oh gosh, I don't know, must have been 20 years, give or take. The other merchants come and go, but me, I like life on the road. You have seriously broken realism and immersion there. Khajiit do not say I, they do not say me. They use their name, they use this one, and they use Khajiit infrequently. That third one really doesn't happen as often as you might think. So, if someone is going to speak like this, if you have a Khajiit who does speak with personal pronouns, that has to be a character trait that is discussed. The player should be able to say, wow, you don't talk like other Khajiit, and the Khajiit caravan leader could explain, yeah, I was actually raised in Daggerfall or whatever. And then you have a backstory, but if you do not have that sort of backstory and explanation, it's just going to come off as wrong. This is really important for the beast races. It also does apply, though, for the human and elven races as well. If you encounter a burly Nord who speaks like a high elf, it will feel wrong. And in order to determine that, again, ask other people who know the world whether it feels right in terms of race. So that's word choice. That's very, very granular. But let's look at plot a bit more. And I'm just going to read this one. When the player enters the throne room for the first time and interacts with Count Nobilis, the following dialogue occurs. You're a new face. I haven't seen you around before. Welcome to Anvil. The player responds, is there anything I should know about the city? And then the Count says, yes, we're going through a difficult time at the moment. A group of evil cultists have abducted my young daughter. I've agreed to give them the crown jewels in exchange for my girl's life. Would you mind taking the cultist leader this priceless ruby for me? The cultists are in the hills. Here's a key to the secret passage out of the castle, the one only the ruler himself is supposed to know about. Good luck, stranger. The number of times I see this sort of thing in student writing, you would not believe. There is no reason why the Count would trust the player with the life of one of his family members, with the crown jewels of so much money, so much power, so much love for his family, given to a complete stranger. Does not work that way. You would never go from, I haven't seen you around before, to, can you save the most important thing in my life? And yet, I see this all the time. You have to establish trust with the NPC you're talking to before you can have anything like this. This isn't to say that you couldn't have a quest like this. This would be a fun quest. But you have to have established a relationship before you can be asked something really important. So here's a way to fix that with a different example. Player finds Excellentia sitting on a bench by the harbor. When they interact with her, the following dialogue occurs. Oh, you startled me, stranger. Was there something you needed? Player says, you seemed lost in your thoughts. I was, yes. It's so easy to get caught up in the past and everything that happened before. Well, it doesn't matter now anyway. Now you have a persuade check. This is based on your speech skill. If you are going to give a persuade check option, you should also give a non-persuade check option. I didn't hear because of space considerations, but just for writers, always have one that isn't a persuade, because some role players don't like persuading. They're not playing someone persuasive, so they should be able to say something that isn't a persuade. Also, if it's a newer player, their level might not be high enough, and you don't want them to just automatically fail everything. It's very discouraging. But if you do have a persuade check, you can fail it, in which case she says, "Oh no, I'm fine." And the dialogue ends. Notice that here I have not locked this dialogue, so if the player comes back later when their speech skill is higher, they can have the same dialogue and have a success. I like doing that when possible, if it makes sense logically, just so that you don't block possible quest options just because the player got there a little early. It is not the most realistic thing to do. The most realistic thing to do is to never have an option for this conversation again. This is a moment where, for the sake of gameplay, it actually helps to be a little bit malleable with your rules about realism. If you have success, though, she'll tell you about her brother who was in a shipwreck, but she has hope still that he survived the shipwreck and he was a strong swimmer. Then the player has two options. One of them is saying, you should let him go and move on. That option does not lead to a quest, because you have essentially said, stop hoping he's dead. She doesn't trust you. That's a nasty thing to say to someone who is hoping that their loved one is still alive. So she just says, I suppose so, no need to discuss it further. Dialogue ends. In this case, I probably would lock after that. I just didn't put it in for some reason. But that would be a good case for her no longer to trust the stranger with anything about her life. And you would lose the opportunity to have a quest. If you do say, I'm sure he's out there somewhere, she says thank you. Dialogue ends. You do not immediately go into the quest. You could, but it's actually more realistic if you end the dialogue and then the quest is unlocked, and then the next time you talk to her or the next time you pass her, you can start the quest then, now that you have established something. It's fine to do it the other way, but make sure that it's not the most intense quest ever based upon like 2 responses from the player. Just thinking back to how Count Nobilis immediately gave you all of the information about the castle's secret passage and stuff based on 1 response, you really want to build a relationship, not just immediately have one. So one way to make life easier for yourself is to do greeting changes. Greetings are the things that play when a NPC passes. They're also the start of dialogue, and it's the same pool that you draw from, whether you're walking past someone or whether you are interacting with them. Greetings double up there. So if you think, do you get to the Cloud District often? That is a greeting. I don't think he actually has any dialogue, but it still counts as a greeting. In terms of greeting changes, it's such an easy way to reflect what you have done as a player for quests in the region, whether you have done a quest for this person, which has changed their opinion of you. So just taking a couple examples here, Randrajo has nothing to say to you, stranger, be on your way, is if you haven't done the quest for him. If you have, we get, we meet again, friend, this one is always pleased to see you. So his opinion of you has changed, but his general dialogue doesn't necessarily have to change, and that's good. Standard dialogue is way harder to change than greetings. You have to add all sorts of conditionals. If this is not complete, if this is complete, but the other thing is not complete, it can get very complicated within your standard dialogue document if tons of things are conditional. If you can just change greetings, that's an easy sort of on-off switch to do implementation-wise, and it's simpler to write. So know that greeting changes change the atmosphere of the world nicely, so that suddenly people in town are more antagonistic to you or friendlier to you based on your actions, but you don't actually need to write that much. Greeting changes are awesome. Let's move on to mesorealism, and this has to do with the community level of gameplay and game writing. We often think of NPCs and then we think of quests, and we don't think of how NPCs interact with each other and what builds a realistic town or community. This is something that is somewhat up to the writers and somewhat up to the leads. So make sure you're collaborating well with your leads when you're doing this kind of writing, because they are going to be in charge of certain elements of the town that you're not. First of all, scheduling. Scheduling is the nightmare of every team lead ever. It's so annoying. But scheduling is vitally important for building realism in a town. You need to ask yourself why someone's in a place at a certain time. Yes, you want people to be available so that you can interact with them, talk with them, have quests start. But you can't just have someone sitting on a bench all day waiting for a quest to start. You need to have a reason why someone would go a certain place. I had a writer recently who was having one character stay up until 4 a.m, but in their house, so that the player didn't even know they were up until 4 a.m, and it just didn't make any sense. So in order to make that more realistic, we had the NPC have insomnia, and he went for a walk at 4 a.m, and then he had interactions he could have with the player, and there was an explanation for why he was walking at 4 a.m. He couldn't sleep because he was having a lot of trouble at home. So always ask, why is the person here? What can they do when they're there? We have a lot of NPCs in Skyrim that walk around for apparently no reason. And that's fine, but it's not ideal. People don't go places for no reason most of the time. There's always a reason you're heading to or from a place, so why not have that for your NPCs? So if they're going to the inn, is it to eat? Is it to see someone? Is it to stay overnight because they can't stay in their house for some reason? Make sure that there's a reason and an action or interaction that they can perform. This is where scenes come in. If you have someone go to the marketplace, it's because they need to buy something. So it's an opportunity for a scene between them and the vendor. That kind of interaction brings realism to your world because now people have a reason to go places. They have a shopping list, they have a to-do list, and they therefore become people and not just moving objects that you have to track down. Always make sure that the presence of certain NPCs helps realism and doesn't harm it. If someone is in a place that they really have no place being at all and there's no explanation why they're there, for instance, if like the guard captain is in the middle of the cathedral and it doesn't seem like he's praying and why is he there not up at the citadel, you're going to have to explain that. And if you can't explain that, it's going to look weird. So be aware of scheduling. Scheduling is also often changed in final edits. Help your leads out by making your schedules sensible. Also, 2-hour time blocks are really nice. You can go as low as 1 hour, but make sure that for anything that involves movement from place to place, you give your NPC 2 hours to do it. An hour is approximately 3 minutes in Skyrim, and so if you have a conversation with that NPC, their schedule can get all messed up if you don't give them enough time. So here's a way to make scheduling easier for yourself and make it more realistic for the people who are playing and the people who are in the city. Districts are your friend. There are usually anywhere from 50 to 200 people in a city. You do not need to have them all interact. You do not need to have schedules overlap for 200 people. That would be awful. That would just be a nightmare to try and coordinate. Luckily, that's not how cities work. You work within your neighborhood. You probably don't go into a different neighborhood that often. And certainly you don't need to have your NPCs do that. So if you think of Whiterun, you've got the Cloud District, you've got the Wind District, and you've got the Plains District. The Cloud District is basically just Dragon's Reach. No one from there goes down to the other districts. Their schedules are self-contained, so they can interact with each other, sure, but you really don't have tons of interaction between people who are up there and the rest of the city. The other two districts are a little more integrated, but even so, it's mostly at the marketplace. And then, other than the marketplace, they stick to their own locations, sometimes the inn as well. But because of that, you don't need to have as much difficulty with overlapping schedules. You can have people go to a certain place and not have massive groups of people there at a time, because only the lower city people would be going to the lower city inn. You don't need people from the upper city to do that. So you can treat your cities like 3 different cities, and your NPC interactions, you can limit them to smaller spaces than, say, the entirety of a city. Another thing to note about this that's really fun for realism, that you should definitely talk over with your leads, but that I think brings a huge gameplay and fun element into your world, is collective memory. So let's just say that you are going into the city for the first time, and it seems like nothing has ever happened in the city until you walked in. And suddenly, everybody is alive and everybody is vibrant, but there seems to be no past to the city at all. You don't want that as a player, and you don't want that as a writer. What you want is for the player to be entering a place that existed without the player and will continue to exist without the player. They are there, but they are not the reason that the city is there. The collective memory has to do with things like big events, natural disasters. Do we remember the fire of 100 years ago? Do you remember that storm last winter that took out all of the trees on the hillside? Whatever it is, natural disasters, political things like the death of the count or the assassination of someone, those are in the collective memory of the people. They don't need to always be discussed in standard dialogue, but they could definitely be discussed in scenes. How are you recovering from the house fire? How are you adapting to life now that this, that, or the other thing has happened? This happens in Skyrim. With the Civil War quest line, you'll see changes in dialogue and the ability to ask people or to see interactions of, now that the Stormcloaks have won or now that the Imperials have won, what's different. So it's something that can change, but it's something that affects the whole group of people regardless of player action. A good example of this from an actual project is the town of Grenos in Valenwood. It was destroyed in the 5-Year War. But elves live for a really long time, and so there are still people who remember that. And because there are still people who remember that, they pass down the memories of that to the other generations, and it becomes part of consciousness. It becomes an event that the nearest town certainly remembers, and that other people in the region do as well. So collective memory is your friend. It makes things seem older than they are. Neighborly interactions and relationships are the micro level of that. So you can have, oh, her grandfather jilted my grandmother and they were, supposed to be engaged, and then he ran off with this woman from across town and it was terrible, and so now we don't like them. That sort of neighborly interaction, relationships, old grudges, rivalries, that's what makes a town or a city come alive. You're going to want that, and you're going to want that mostly to stay within your small districts. It doesn't matter if someone has a grudge against someone who lives in the castle if they're a blacksmith. They wouldn't have a reason really to do that. You can make it work, but it's not as interesting as if it's someone who's they're actually going to be interacting with and could have a scene with. So make sure that you're thinking about your cities and your towns as existing without the player. Let's talk about scenes work. This is something that I'm doing a lot with Valenwood right now as we're finishing up, and there are distinct differences between unique scenes and repeatable scenes, and then we're going to go into something called the 3x3, which I think is just amazing. But the difference between a unique scene and a repeatable scene is essentially what changes in the course of this scene. Is the state of being for the NPCs or the world different after the scene as opposed to before it? So let's look at the unique scene up top. Voladir says, Lodaria, I adore you. I think of nothing else. Please end my suffering and accept my heart, my devotion, and my ring. And she responds, Oh, Voladir, how could I say no to you? I accept and will be at your side no matter what trials lie ahead. You cannot repeat the scene because she accepted. So you wouldn't have multiple proposals. That doesn't make sense. She wasn't engaged to him. Now she is engaged to him. Her state of being and his state of being have changed. You can't do that again and over again. It will seem like the Disneyland ride. It's a small world. You really don't want that. But you can change that and make it a repeatable scene that the player can pass multiple times by just changing her response. So he says the same thing, I adore you, take my ring. And she responds, oh, Voladir, not again. How many times do I have to tell you no before you give up? This indicates that he's done this before and he's going to do this again. No state change has occurred. They're still not engaged. He's just trying and she's saying no. So that can happen multiple times. He can try again. Repeatable scenes have to keep the same state of being. Otherwise, you're viewing major life events that wouldn't happen over and over. So let's talk about 3x3 scenes, which I did not know existed, to be honest, until I was researching on UESP for the ways that we could do scenes at Valenwood that wouldn't involve hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lines that need to be recorded. 3x3 scenes are a stroke of genius. Essentially, they do exactly what we just looked at with the repeatable scenes. They don't change state, but you have your first character speak and say the same thing 3 different ways. Your second character speaks, says the same thing 3 different ways. And then your first character responds, same thing, 3 different ways. So Voladir's first thing is, I love you, marry me. Lodaria's is, oh my god, stop. Voladir's like, never, I shall never stop. And those are your 3 emotions, your 3 beats of the scene. But you can say it 3 different ways. So let's just say we are picking 1 and then 3 and then 2. So, Lodaria, I adore you. I think of nothing else. Will you marry me? She responds with, at this point, I'd rather marry a skeever. It'd be less annoying than this. And then he responds, no lovelorn heart can be put off by cruel words. One day you will say yes. The actual implementation of this allows for randomization. And what that means is that out of these 9 lines, you get 27 different options for scenes. They will always be a little different. 9 lines, 27 options, rather than just writing 3 scenes or 2 scenes that cover the same ground, but will be exactly the same. You've now got yourself enough variance that the player is less likely to notice that it's essentially the same thing, or if they do, it's entertaining as opposed to repetitive. So 3x3s, awesome. You can also do 3x2s. It's not quite as many variations, but you still get a lot of use out of them, and it's more economic than doing individual scenes. Not to say that individual scenes aren't great, but when you can do a 3x3, my opinion is do it. So we're going to talk about something a little bit off topic, but it's disposition. You may have noticed that I am giving you a lot of ways to add greetings based on how quests have gone or change things in the world actively. And some people would go, well, why don't you just use disposition? For those of you who don't know what that is, disposition is a 9-point scale, I believe, from the NPC loving you and being in love with you at 4 to -4, where they will attack you on sight. But there are no gradations in between. It is a very, very rough system. If you've ever played something like Dragon Age, any of them, their disposition system has 200 points. To Skyrim's 9. So it's not really great. It's also really easy to mess up if you use the disposition system. Because let's say you did a quest that everybody in town loved. You saved the town, everyone's disposition went up by 2 points. Now everyone's super friendly to you. If you've already done something for one of those NPCs that raised disposition, suddenly they're besties with you or they love you, and that's weird. But it's even weirder in the opposite direction. If you displease someone and you've already displeased them in another way, sometimes a way that you don't even know as a player, everyone's attacking you and you don't know why. Disposition can get so hairy and complicated, and it's confusing to keep track of because you don't remember that in this large quest line, the entire world state gets 1 disposition point up or down. From an implementation perspective, it's just difficult to manage. It's much easier to just say, this quest is over, so these greetings are unlocked, in my opinion. For an example of what a confusing disposition implementation note is, that's the third bullet point there. It would normally be in purple at the end of a line, and it would say, if disposition is less than 2 plus 1 disposition, if disposition is less than 0 plus 2 disposition. Yeah, it's not easy. The pros of disposition are basically that it exists, so I guess you can use it. But I find it way harder and way harder to control. I'm a control freak. I like to know exactly what is going on with my NPCs and my quests at all times. And disposition adds a level of chaos that I'm not fond of. So that's my opinion on that. Let's talk about quests, though, at a meso level, at the community level. And this goes back to the idea of trust. So chained quests are not the same as a quest line. Quest lines have a theme. They're usually faction-based. So if you think of the Dark Brotherhood quest line, it's all about killing people or preparing to kill people. Those are your things. They're the assassins. Why would it be about anything else? Chained quests don't have to have a theme, but they tend to have a location, and they tend to build in a way that is both fun for the player and realistic, because you don't get the quest where you save the Count's daughter immediately, but you can get it after you've done some other work. So looking at the example, this NPC has their standard dialogue. That is the indication that all of the stuff they would normally say is there, just in those angle brackets, standard dialogue. And then, if the quest, Mine All Mine, is complete, they have another option. The town seems like it's seen better days. NPC responds, indeed it has, traveler, though thanks to you, our miners will have a chance to return to their tunnels without fearing for their lives. Reference to the previous quest. And then, I wonder, might you be willing to face another challenge, one of a more magical nature? This leads into the next quest in the chain, and it doesn't have anything to do with the mine. This is a magical quest. This is a completely different thing. But the only reason that this NPC trusts the player to embark upon that quest is because they have already proven their worth in the first one. So these little diagrams at the bottom here are different options for chaining quests. Your traffic light on its side one over in the left is the easiest one. You start with the green quest, fetch quest. It leads you to a misc quest, and after that, you get a side quest, and it's just a linear progression. And this is easy, this is fun. It isn't the most effective use of chaining, in my opinion, but it does allow for at least a bit more realism than just letting all quests be available at all times. Personally, I love the center diagram. So, looks confusing, but follow me here. You can start with either green quest. Either green quest leads you to the misc quest that's yellow. The yellow one leads you to the orange one, and then depending on what you do in the orange one, so if you, say, side with one faction or side with another, you get a different final side quest. So your actions within the quest line determine where the quest line goes next, and your actions at the beginning of the quest line lead you all the way to the end of it. So it becomes a web of quests, and it means replayability is a thing, because if you changed your mind in the orange one, you would lead to a different final side quest there. So chaining quests, lots of fun. Your last one is just a numbers game, really. If you do 3 quests, you get a bigger one. That's fine. That's basically building reputation in a town. It's similar to the way you get made into a Thane in Skyrim, where if you help out 3 people, then you get the title. It's like that, but you get a quest at the end instead of a title and a sword or a shield or whatever. So it works fine. It's not a bad way to go, but it doesn't really build the way that true chaining does. So let's talk about macrorealism. This is the world space. A lot of this is not up to you. A lot of the true world space is up to your leads and the head of the project. Things like, what biomes are you in? How close are cities to each other? You have to work with that, but you don't get to decide it. The big thing for macrorealism for me is why. Why are these things happening? So just take a look at this example for me. As the player leaves through the Riften City gates, Brawlins will force greet. "Ho there, traveler, you seem to be headed north. Could I ask a favor of you? I've lost my favorite pair of boots, you see." The player responds, "You want me to retrieve your boots?" And then the NPC says, "Yes, indeed. I was out trapping rabbits and accidentally left them in a cave the locals call the Cavern of Unbelievable Peril. Silly me, but oh well, what can you do? I'll mark the location on your map. Let me know if you find them." And then the map updates showing that the Cavern of Unbelievable Peril is just outside of Markarth. There are so many things wrong with this, and yet I see this all the time. First thing that's wrong. Markarth is nowhere near Riften. If you were anywhere trapping rabbits, you would not be going to the other side of Skyrim to do so. Not without explanation, certainly. Second, why would you trap rabbits in a place called the Cavern of Unbelievable Peril? You know it's called that. You're a hunter. What are you doing? And then the third one, how do you lose your boots and get all the way back to Riften? Like, how? So much wrong here. What you need to make sure is the locations make sense. If someone lost something in a cave, it's got to be a cave nearby. Or if it's not a cave nearby, they moved to the new city, they used to live near the cave, there was a reason for them to be in the cave. Make sure that there is a reason for the object or reward to be there, that the locations make sense to where you get the quest, and that it makes sense that the quest giver knows where to send the player. So if they say, "Oh, bandits have taken my ancestral amulet," or whatever, they can't really say, "They've taken it to this place in the hills in this specific cavern," unless they followed them there or know that that's the bandits' hideout. And if so, indicate why. So that has to do with realism in the larger world space, where things are in relation to the person who gives the quest and in relation to the player. World interactions are things you're probably not going to have to deal with for a long time, because they're generally done at the end, but they're fun. So I wanted to add them because they add so much realism. These are the people that you meet just randomly, and you can meet them in two basic places. One, on the road, two, in the wilderness, and it's completely different who you're meeting in each of those places. If you think of the roads, you're going to meet highwaymen, caravans, pilgrims, military patrols, refugees. These are people who are headed to cities. They are headed to larger places, or they're there to prey upon people who are headed to larger places, like highwaymen. There's a reason they're called highwaymen, not wilderness men. They're not going to actually succeed at stealing stuff from travelers if they're not on the roads. So those people you can write as road people. Other people, wilderness. People who are lost, get them lost in a wilderness. It doesn't make as much sense to be lost on the road. Necromancers and hermits and anyone who wants to hide, witches, things like that, they're in the wilderness. They're not going to be exposing themselves to the military patrols that are on the roads. Hunters, you don't hunt on a road. And people who are escaping from something. So if you're wondering what a world interaction is like, you've probably, if you've played Skyrim, encountered a guy who runs up to you and says, "Hold this," and gives you something stolen. He runs off. Someone else comes a second later and says, "Did you see the thief?" You can either give back the object, you can lie and say you didn't see the thief, you can send him after the thief. You have options, but it really doesn't affect anything. But it adds to the realism of the place, so you're not just running through pretty landscape. World interactions are like potpourri. You can just sort of spread it around and it makes the whole place smell better and be nicer, but it doesn't take huge amounts of work. So really consider your world interactions. When realism isn't an option. So sometimes it doesn't work for you to be realistic. It really doesn't. Here's an example from settlements. The innkeeper is always awake. No one is always awake in life, but the innkeeper has to always be awake. Otherwise, you can't rent a room, and then what are you supposed to do? It becomes really difficult to play the game if you're playing it as someone who actually needs to rent a room, if you don't have constant access to the innkeeper. Eating is optional. This is for the player, but it's also for the NPCs. All of the people who are running stores, they don't eat in the middle of the day. They can't. They need to be running stores. So another thing, walking is absolutely everyone's favorite thing, and there's no working from home. Both of these things have to do with the fact that the player needs to encounter the NPCs. If they don't encounter the NPCs, they can't start quests, they can't get a sense of the world. So while in an actual medieval town, walking would probably not be everyone's favorite thing, and they would not be going for random walks in the middle of the day, it is in Skyrim and in other video games, because otherwise you're just not going to run into people. Also, in an actual town, people would have cottage industries. That's why they're called cottage industries. You do them from home. Things like weaving. Nobody does those because you would never interact with that NPC if they were in their home. They can be outside their home, but they can't be in it. Also, nobody gathers in large groups. That has to do with the engine. You don't want huge amounts of NPCs in one place most of the time because it just becomes a mess. So small gatherings happen more than large gatherings. Quest things. Daedra have no idea that you have helped other Daedra. When you do Boethia's quest, she has no idea that you've also done Molag Balls. And that's fine, because if you did have Daedra know that you have worked for other Daedra, you would get locked out of quests as a player. And you don't want that for your players. You want them to be able to experience the world. You also put effort into writing that quest, so you want people to play it. So it's fine that they just have no idea, despite being gods, that you have done anything else. Altmer can join the Stormcloaks. Why? Because you don't want people who chose to play Altmer to have only one option in a major faction questline. Does it make sense? Probably not. You can make it make sense, but it's very forced. And then the big one, you've murdered an emperor at the end of the Dark Brotherhood questline. Nobody cares. You're not persecuted at all. You're not having people constantly come after you. You're not the most wanted person in Skyrim. Because if you were, it would ruin everything else that you were playing. So this is the sort of time where what would actually happen in the world doesn't work for gameplay. Let's just do a quick recap here. Make sure you earn the NPC's trust before granting quests or before unlocking new dialogue that tells you more about the person or the place. It isn't realistic to have someone tell you their life story immediately or give you an assignment without knowing they can trust you. Chain quests together to make story arcs that engage you in a location and make you invest, I suppose, in the well-being of the people of that location. Make sure absolutely everyone has a reason to be where they are. No random people just wandering outside. It does not make sense. And then if all else fails, the story comes first. So if you have to do something like keep someone just standing outside of the bandit camp 24/7, okay. As long as it serves the story, I get it. It's fine. So story comes first, realism is second, but know that the more realism you add, the more invested someone's going to be in your story. Alrighty. So let's do a brief Q&A. We have 8 minutes. That's not bad for me. Does anyone have any questions on writing realism?
Do we have any limits or like any kind of standard of consistency between the projects and the base game? Because the base game notoriously doesn't have a very inconsequential. It has a very inconsequential way of doing things. Like your allegiance matters very little. There aren't a lot of consequences to your actions. Whereas in a different game like Mass Effect, you'd have a lot more branching going on. Do you try to keep things at a certain level, or do you just let your writers do whatever when it comes to quests and their consequences?
It depends project by project, but I do think we believe at Beyond Skyrim in general, to make a vast generalization, that consequences should have more of a impact than they do in vanilla. Because sometimes vanilla, you're like, why did I even choose this? This does nothing. And we don't want that. We want you to have the experience of a person, and a person does have consequences for their actions. Obviously, for some gameplay purposes, we can't have, for instance, everyone going after you because you killed the Emperor, but we can have, oh, you've joined this faction, or you've joined you've done this particular set of quests in this way. Now people react to you differently. So that's something I think all of the projects are attempting to do in their own ways. But yeah, you're right. I mean, BioWare games in general have way more in terms of consequences than Bethesda games.
I sort of have a question. So when it comes to the chaining of quests, what would you say is the limit for the entry point to a quest line, so that it doesn't make the implementation process too difficult? Because let's say there are 4 ways to enter a certain area, and there is no other way than these 4 ways. And how does it impact the implementation? How do you work with the 4 different possibilities of the player getting introduced to the action, to the faction, or an area, or in general a quest line?
Now, I'm not an implementer specifically, so I might be off base with this, but my understanding is it's actually not difficult at all, because you just unlock based on whether or not you've done any of those. So say you've done one of the 4 little quests that can lead you into this particular faction. At the end of that quest, it says quest completed, unlock faction quest 1. And if you do any of them, it says quest completed, unlock faction quest 1. So as long as you don't have to do like 3 out of 4 of them or something like that, if it's really just 1, that's quite simple. And even if it is a selection, like I said, you had do 3 fetch quests, you unlock a side quest, that's actually not as bad as you would think it is. It's only really complicated, I think, when you have too many options from a single quest. So depending on your actions within one quest, you could go into 3 different quests, which then go into 2 different quests themselves, and then you get a sort of branching situation where the player doesn't actually have as many options as you want them to. The goal as a writer is to give the player the option to do as many of the quests as you can. You really don't want to lock people out of lots of quests. So in that situation that you gave where you could do 4 different ones and it would lead you to a faction one, I would say make sure that the player can still do any of those 4 after the faction is unlocked, because then they still have access to those little quests. It just doesn't have the reward of the faction being unlocked.
Okay, I also have a follow-up question. How difficult is it to make the NPCs in a faction recognize that you've come this place and not the other? Is it difficult to implement the dialogue in a way that recognizes, the history of the player, how they've come to be there, who maybe brought them there, and all of that stuff?
No, not to. As long as you're doing it to a small extent, as long as you're not changing like the entire experience if you took route A to get there. If it's just a couple of lines of like, well, I'm glad to see that you did quest A or something about that. All you do is an implementation note at the beginning that says if the player completed blank. So if the player completed quest A, this line will play. If the player completed quest B, this line will play. So for small things like that, it's very easy. As long as you're not changing the actual course of events and it's just a dialogue thing, it's not hard at all. If you're changing the actions of the characters. So if they did quest A, their next task would be different than if they did quest B to get into the faction. That becomes complicated. But when it just becomes an acknowledgement of what the player has already done, very easy. Any last questions? I will turn it over to Hendris for the next one if we don't have any more.
Okay, so it's me again. I sort of have a different question, not regarding the chaining and all of that stuff. So it's common in Skyrim that when you kill an NPC, the quest associated with that NPC just break. Do you in Beyond Skyrim have a way to work around that, and again, for the NPCs to acknowledge the absence of an NPC and work around it, and kind of possibly start a different small quest regarding the death of an NPC, or maybe if an NPC is not dead and just is away. Do you have a way to work around that, or is it too complicated for the just for the engine for the Skyrim?
Well, frankly, it's just a pain in the neck for the writers, because you don't want to have to write. Think about it if you're in a town of like 15 people and your player has randomly killed the blacksmith. No apparent reason. Now everyone has to adjust their schedules because they can't go see the blacksmith. They have to have lines that say, oh my god, the blacksmith was murdered. And any quest related to the blacksmith has to either not happen at all or has to have a different person starting it. Now imagine you've got 15 people, you don't know who the player is going to kill. So now you need lines for every single one of those NPCs to, like, all of their quests can be started by different people. Imagine if the blacksmith quest could be started by the innkeeper, but now the innkeeper's dead too. Does that break it? And why didn't it break it with just the blacksmith? So it gets into a lot of complicated territory. And what it means from a writing perspective is you have to write all sorts of hypothetical situations and record those lines that might never actually be used unless the player just randomly murdered someone. So that's very complicated. If it's something that's part of a quest, for instance, you're doing a Dark Brotherhood quest, you kill someone and they could have given you a quest, except that as part of another quest they're killed, that's much easier to get around because that is actually a specific person you know is going to die, as opposed to predicting whether the player's just going to kill anyone.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Hendris, you want to jump in?
Hang on.